So I've just come across the Channel 4 news report, debate from the end of last year, and I want to talk about this because it's extremely rare that this subject is ever mentioned on the mainstream media. So I do think it's important to discuss. The subject is of masculinity, specifically in Britain, and what it means to be masculine. I think the question was, I'll put a link to the broadcast. Is masculinity gone in Britain? Something along those lines. So basically, the report started off in a boxing gym in London, which is seen as a very sort of macho place. Female reporter, and she was sort of talking about, she was interviewing some of the coaches and so on, and they were advocating things like respect towards women, but also competitiveness and this sort of thing. Now, in the discussion panel was a man who was the author of a book about fatherhood, a young woman, I forget her name now, who runs a charity in Sheffield which helps young people gain confidence, but it definitely sounds biased in favour of girls based on what she was saying, and I've looked at the website directly. It's called the Gold Digger Trust. And Diane Abbott, who's a well-known Labour Party figure and outspoken feminist. So this 9-minute segment was interesting, but it really wasn't long enough to touch on all the issues. I do believe to some extent there is a crisis of masculinity in this country. I believe there is a massive pressure on young men. I say that because I've personally felt it. I'm a young man, and I felt it. On a whole range of issues. And I think there's two sources to blame for this. Number one is patriarchy, and number two is feminism. Hear me out before you automatically rush to judge that. Firstly, I do think patriarchy has to take some of the blame in terms of the sort of expectations it put on men. Men did suffer from patriarchy, arguably just as much as women. I mean, for centuries, it was a case that women didn't have some of the same legal rights as men, certainly in terms of voting, land ownership and that sort of thing, which is a very important issue. But the feminist argument, not to change the subject here, but the feminist argument about male privilege is very, very misleading, because actually, with that privilege, so-called, came massive responsibility. I've already mentioned, for example, the unique pressures that men face in wartime, that women never have to face. For example, in World War I, when the vast majority of fatalities, the vast majority, were men. But there was always this thing from patriarchy that, for example, men couldn't show their emotions. Real men couldn't show their emotions. Real men had to be responsible breadwinners and this sort of thing. Now, Diana raised the idea of industrialisation in Britain, and she argues that is why masculinity has declined, because the source that provided them with masculinity, i.e. being the breadwinners, is largely gone. But there was something ironic in a feminist talking about lost masculinity, because it is, in my opinion, the feminist movement, the modern Western feminist movement, that is largely responsible for putting a lot of contemporary pressure on men. Now, what I mean by that is the medium for male empowerment, which was supposedly industrialisation, is now largely gone. So men today largely have no voice. And in large part, I believe it is because of the feminist movement. Because whenever men's issues are discussed, which is hardly ever in the media, but when they are, feminists like Diane Abbott, well, maybe I shouldn't pick on her individually, but feminism as a movement does shout down these issues. It trivializes them, it ignores them, it makes excuses for them, and it presents this very distorted picture of women are downtrodden victims and men are all privileged princes. That's the sort of image that feminism puts across. And feminism never, ever, ever, ever says anything positive about men and masculinity. So on one hand, Diana is saying there's this lost role for men, and she's sort of trying to imply that she cares about young men. I don't believe that feminists have much compassion at all for young men. I believe it's a movement that's driven by content. But it's ironic that she's talking about young men feeling a loss of identity, and she's blaming patriarchy for that sort of, like, for example, pornography and so on. Although I don't know if that could be called patriarchy, but I think that's part of the problem. I'm not disregarding the things she's saying, but what bothers me, what frustrates me, is that the irony of this is lost, because it's feminists like Diane Abbott that are constantly running men down that makes it difficult for men to ever voice their opinions. Men who, for example, might well feel alienated. So there's a real hypocrisy here. And the young woman who runs a charity in Sheffield, now, I don't know enough about that charity to comment in detail, but I briefly looked at their website. They're called the Gold Digger Trust. It's based in Sheffield. Supposedly it's about motivating young people. Now, on the surface that seems like a good idea. I can't criticise that, and I think it probably has some good intentions. And to her credit, she did, for example, several points say that not all young men are driven by sort of a bad attitude towards sex and relationships, i.e. this notion that all young men want sex and all young women want love. I mean, now that's a big distortion anyway, anyone who believes that. Because there's a lot of young men who are actually quite romantic, and there's a lot of young women who just want sex. So it isn't a case of all young men just want sex and all young women just want love. I mean, speaking for myself, I have a very romantic notion. I want love. You know, sex would be great, but believe me, I'm not motivated just by sex. So there's this stereotype that's put out about men, but the feminist movement is largely responsible for doing that. It's also macho magazines like Nuts and Zoo, which I have very little time for. They have to take a big part of the blame as well, because they try to put this role, like, sort of, not role model, hell, that's the wrong word, but they put this sort of stereotype of what a man should be, like the sort of Jack the Lad image, like, you know, loving the idea of a sexy girl, etc., etc. Now, there's nothing wrong with being attracted to the opposite sex. There's nothing wrong with sexuality, but there is an argument to be made about that lad culture putting a lot of pressure on young men. But it's almost even harder for young men today than it was in the past, because in the past they had pressure from patriarchy. Today they have pressure from patriarchy and feminism. On one hand is that sort of macho culture which puts a lot of pressure on young men to sort of be a Jekyll-Hyde type figure. On the other hand is feminists who constantly run men down and constantly vilify men. So it is actually bloody hard sometimes to be a young man. And it is true that young women also face huge pressure. For example, there's issues of sexual exploitation. There's the terrible rape conviction rate. There's issues like that. But the difference is, I strongly believe that women's issues are talked about, men's issues are ignored. That's just a fact. If you look at the media, barely a day goes by when a national newspaper won't be talking about some feminist issue or another. But compare that to the absolute lack of coverage on men's issues. It's glaring, actually. So part of the problem is men feel that they have absolutely no vacuum. And a lot of young men don't feel like they can talk about this, because the feminist movement will automatically brand them a misogynist if they dare raise. As a man, if I talk about men's issues, I'm automatically accused of not caring about women's issues, which is a lot of rubbish, because I fully acknowledge there's a lot of women's issues out there. But I just hate the hypocrisy of only focusing on one gender. Look, the simple reality is, both men and women, males and females, face issues that are much more predominant to them. So for example, on the issue of sexual abuse, that's something that much more impacts women. On the issue of homelessness, that is something that much more impacts men. But how often do we hear about that? We might hear about the homeless, but how often do you hear that that is overwhelmingly men that suffer that? Now, I'm not saying that women don't, but it's just a fact. Crisis, the well-known homeless charity, reports that 74% of those who visit their centres are men. So there's glaring divide there. But all we ever hear about in the mainstream media is about how awful it is for women. And I'm sick of that sort of hypocrisy. So this debate that I've just watched only really raised a very, very minimum amount of the issues that are out there. There's enormous pressure on young men. If a young man is not seen to be financially stable, then he's automatically branded a deadbeat. There's enormous pressure on young men to be stable in order to get to appeal to a young woman, because otherwise he is seen as not being able to provide her with stability. And that's not her fault, it's not his fault, it's just the way it is. And I'm not blaming feminism for that. In fact, feminism would argue, oh well, we argued for this notion of a strong independent woman. Now there's some merit in that, because it does take some of the burden off men having to provide. So I'm not blaming feminism for that. I think that's more a problem of patriarchy. The problem is, there's a lot of young women who are really taken in by that, and who sort of, actually maybe less so in this country than some Eastern countries. The situation in countries like Japan and China and South Korea is terrible, because young men are in an impossible position. They either have to be successful businessmen or basically, sorry to be crude, but they're fucked. And young women, the pressure in those societies is they have to be married by the age of 27. So there's pressure on them as well. In Western society, I believe feminism has had some positive influence. I'm not going to sit here and say it's all bad. I think feminism has done some positive things, and certainly that would be one of them, taking away some of the burden from traditional expectations of men. So that would be one positive thing. But the problem is, so much of feminist rhetoric today is negative, is divisive, is basically anti-male. Now, the average feminist will say, oh no, we don't hate men, we've nothing against men, in fact feminism helps men. But they don't reflect that actually so much of the rhetoric is negative. When was the last time any feminist publicly said something positive about men or masculinity? So on one hand they're saying that Diane Abbott and this young woman were saying that men have no role models, which by the way I dispute. I can name several male celebrities who I would call good guys, who are also tough guys. Take for example the boxer Joe Calzaghe. He's an undefeated professional boxer. Now he's advocated a campaign to beat bullying. So he's doing something benevolent. I would call him a pretty good role model for the most part. I'm not saying he's perfect, but there's many other examples. Lennox Lewis not so long ago made a commercial against domestic violence, against hitting women. Now, surely feminists would agree that's a good role model. There you have a tough guy, unquestionably a man's man, advocating women's rights. So this idea that to be for women's rights you cannot be a strong masculine man is a lot of rubbish. I consider myself in many ways an alpha male, but I abhor the idea of violence against women, and I will always speak out against it. And I am passionate about women's rights. I'm passionate about men's rights. I'm passionate about human rights. But I am convinced that the issue of men's rights is shamefully ignored by the mass media. Shamefully. And I do think feminism is partly to blame for that, because feminism has enormous influence in the media. They'll of course deny that, but it actually does. Not in the Sun newspaper, but in so much of the mainstream media. You will very, very, very often hear feminist rhetoric, especially in politics. You know, there's a lot of debate about the lack of women in government, but actually look at the feminist orientation of debate in government. It's all about women's rights. I mean, there is a department in government, a women's minister. I think it's officially called the Secretary of State for Women and Equality. Why not the Secretary of State for Equality? What that does is it patronises women, and it completely, by insinuation, ignores the many issues that men face. It's an oxymoron. You cannot have a department for equality that completely ignores half the population. That's just an oxymoron. And part of the problem is, it's this notion that just because the most powerful politicians and business people happen to be men, then that is a universal picture. you could argue the most vulnerable people in society are also men, i.e. the homeless. Like I've already said, the majority of homeless people are men. So that doesn't correlate. Just because the most powerful politicians are, I mean, don't forget that's a very small body of people. So I don't think you can use that as a barometer. Yes, they're powerful people, but we're talking about 600 politicians, if we're talking about cabinet level, 23 in a country of 64 million people. So it's not really a good barometer at all. You need to look at wider society if you want a barometer of equality. Just looking at politics and business is misleading. Although, of course, they're important, but it's a misleading thing. So, I just feel very frustrated that so much of this debate is about making men feel guilty, about, we're talking about loss of masculinity, but let's talk about the fact that men don't have a voice. And just for the record, I don't consider myself a men's rights activist. I don't agree with everything they come out with, some of the more militant men's rights people, because they come out with things just as outrageous as the most extreme feminists, and I don't agree with that. I do believe in women's rights, and I do believe that there are issues in Britain that do impact women that need to be spoken about. So it's not so much that I have any problem with women's issues being talked about. In fact, I would fully advocate that. But it does frustrate me that that is at the same time when men's issues are completely ignored. How can that be a fair situation? I would say it's roughly 50-50 in Britain today in terms of the issues that impact women and the issues that impact men. I would honestly argue it's about 50-50. And of course feminists will say that's a lot of crap. Men are princes of privilege and women are downtrodden. That is basically the feminist argument. Because they're a divisive movement. It's basically agree with us or else. And it's basically this constant promotion of female victimhood versus male privilege, which is a massive distortion. A massive distortion. I would ask a feminist this simple question. What privilege does an alcoholic man living on the streets of a major city have with people walking past him all day? Tell me what privilege a man like that has. Tell me what privilege a father denied access to his children has, even if he's a loving father. Tell me what privilege a young man who's made the wrong decisions in life and who's done something stupid has, who has then went to prison. And I'm not saying he shouldn't go to prison, but I'm saying that again, that is something that overwhelmingly impacts men. So this notion of male privilege is one of the most dangerous pieces of distortion that feminists put out, and it's something I cannot tolerate because it is just so wrong. You see, they base that notion on the fact that the top politicians happen to be men. But you cannot judge societal privilege just based on one type of career, i.e. politics or business, because it does not reflect the whole picture. You have Labour people saying the government needs to reflect society, but their opinion also needs to reflect reality. And when you have Labour Party feminists like Rachel Reeves coming out and saying, oh, the Tories are all sexist, I would argue, well, you're sexist because you're ignoring men's issues, which the Labour Party does. It callously does. So just to clarify, this is not an issue. I had a left-wing nutjob attack me earlier, far left. I don't even want to get into that, but he claimed that I don't consider his rant even worthy talking about, but it's an example of the sort of mentality that anyone who speaks up on this issue has to face. Because feminism is actually a very aggressive and very powerful movement, and it basically shouts down anyone who disagrees. So it's important that this issue was raised on Channel 4, but in my opinion, it is not raised anywhere near enough. A 9-minute segment at the end of last year is not good enough, because the daily, if you look at a newspaper, I guarantee you, on almost a daily basis there will be something that feminists care about in the paper. Even in the tabloids. Hell, even the Sun will talk about women's issues, although of course paid free is a disgrace, I know that, but the point here is men's issues are callously ignored. So if you truly believe in equality, if you call yourself a feminist and you truly believe in equality, you'll say, yes, sure, let's talk about women's issues, but let's also talk about men's issues. Let's talk about the issues that impact men. At the moment, they're callously ignored. It's indisputable. It is indisputable. Because of the false premise that all men are princes of privilege and all women are downtrodden. That is basically the line that feminists take. And I think it's dangerous, because it's distortion. And when you have distortion in a democracy, there cannot be real debate. And unfortunately there can't be real debate at the moment, because anyone in a position of power who does raise these issues, say for example a male politician, and I've seen it, I've seen male politicians in the Commons talk for example about fathers' rights and they shout it down. That's not democratic. So I'll put a link to the video I've just watched, let you make your own judgment. And if I come across any extremists, like the guy that contacted me earlier, you can have different opinions. I'll allow free expression on my comment section, but I'm not going to tolerate the bullshit that I'd done earlier. And that person knows who they are. I'm not going to put up with it. Because if I make a video that provides one of the very few platforms to discuss these issues, I'm not going to let it be hijacked by extremists.